In 1979, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat signed a peace treaty with the State of Israel.
Let there be no more wars or bloodshed.
He was walking away from the Palestinians. He was opting for a separate peace.
He had broken the rules. He had gone to a forbidden land.
Let there be no more suffering or denial of rights.
Many people in the Arab world thought this was a stab in the back.
He had political courage. He knew that he was taking a very heavy chance.
He even expected that he might be killed for it.
Anwar Sadat, now on Biography. It was high drama and higher risk. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat had just landed at Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv, Israel. In the 3 decades since the United Nations created the Jewish state, Egypt and Israel had fought 5 wars. No Arab leader had ever dared set foot on Israeli soil or speak publicly to an Israeli official.
This was a whole sea change in the history of the Middle East. Here they were shaking hands. They were patting each other on the back. Golda Meir, who had recently been head of the Israeli state, she said, "Why didn't you tell me you wanted to come to Israel?"
The date was November 19th, 1977. After years of bloodshed and third-party negotiations, Anwar Sadat had come to Israel in person to talk peace.
What I really, at heart, want from this visit, that the wall of that was created between us and the Israelis because of the psychological problems comes down.
Sadat called his trip a sacred mission. Syrian radio called it the blackest day in Arab history. Either way, it was the sort of courageous political gesture offered at great personal and political peril that became the hallmark of Sadat's presidency.
When he went to Jerusalem, his foreign minister refused to go. Several others refused to go. They were afraid if they agreed to go that they would be assassinated.
He had broken the rules. He had gone to a forbidden land, and he had done it without consulting his people.
Many people in the Arab world thought this was a stab in the back by the most powerful Arab nation. They felt that Sadat had sold out.
Sadat had come to Israel to negotiate 2 long-standing issues: Israeli withdrawal from occupied Arab territories and the creation of an independent Palestinian state. After decades of on-again, off-again talks, Sadat's peace initiative unfolded at lightning speed. It had begun just 9 days earlier, when, departing from his prepared speech, Sadat told the Egyptian parliament he would be willing to go anywhere, even to the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, to discuss peace. 4 days later, he repeated the offer to CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite.
I said, "When are you going to Israel?" And he said, "I am going just as soon as there is peace." And I said, well, that is your condition before you would go to Israel. No, Walter. He said, "I have no conditions."
The only condition is that I want to discuss the whole situation with the 120 members of the Knesset.
Media savvy and master of the dramatic political gesture, Sadat knew his words would grab headlines worldwide.
He was a showman, and he realized in the minds of the rest of the world he was also a superstar. And so he played that card constantly, and he toyed with the foreign press especially, whom he knew would respond to his theatrical gestures.
Sadat was a visionary.
He was a very broad thinker. He could think in terms of the strategy for Egypt for the next 30 years, which is unusual in a statesman.
And he was a high-stakes gambler.
I admire most of all in a politician courage, and there are not many who can claim it. He had political courage.
He understood that what he was doing was risky. He even expected that he might be killed for it.
Sadat's trip took him into a minefield of issues, any one of which could have detonated, destroying the peace initiative. Negotiations were frequently deadlocked, but Sadat hung in there.
He had a strong conviction, and that conviction came from a sense of faith that what he was doing was the right thing.
After 2 years of grueling negotiations, Sadat flew to Washington to meet with Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and President Jimmy Carter. There, in front of the White House, the two former enemies signed the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab state.
Let there be no more wars or bloodshed between Arabs and Israelis. Let there be no more suffering or denial of rights.
Though applauded in the West, Sadat's actions were condemned throughout the Arab world, setting in motion events that would cost him his life. Anwar Sadat's journey toward the historic 1979 peace treaty with Israel began 6 years earlier in Egypt's Sinai Desert. The Israelis had occupied the Sinai since 1967, when their surprise attack routed the Egyptian army. After such a humiliating loss, no one expected Sadat would dare go to war over the Sinai. But he did. This time, the vaunted Israeli army was caught unaware and suffered severe losses. By the time a ceasefire was finally organized, the Israelis had regained the upper hand. Nevertheless, the war was hailed throughout the Arab world as a brilliant victory. Sadat's high-stakes gamble shattered the myth of Israeli invincibility, opening the way to an eventual Israeli-Egyptian peace agreement.
The October War gave Egypt back its manhood. Right? Right.
As president, Sadat took enormous risks to achieve peace. The courage to go his own way, he said, grew from years of adversity, beginning with his impoverished childhood in the village of Miet Abul Kam.
Life is hard, but really what is rewarding in this is that the principles and the morale in the village is something very superior, really superior.
Sadat was born in Miet Abul Kam on Christmas Day, 1918. His father was a poor military hospital clerk, his mother an illiterate Sudanese. Sadat had 12 brothers and sisters. As a young man, Sadat dreamed of being an actor. But in 1936, Egypt's upper-class-only military academy was open to all citizens, and his father managed to win him an appointment.
Well, Sadat would have been a peasant. I mean, the army was the instrument of mobility. So this was the way out of poverty and the way into politics.
At the academy, Sadat befriended Jamal Abdel Nasser, the future president of Egypt.
That class of young boys who went into the academy in 1936 changed Egyptian history forever and was a break with centuries and centuries of Egyptian life when the Egyptians were always ruled by foreigners.
When Sadat grew up, it was the British who ruled Egypt. Like many of his generation, he saw them as oppressors. As a child, his hero had been Ataturk, a Turkish revolutionary who overthrew the Ottoman Empire. The young Sadat dreamed of doing the same to the British. He began pursuing that dream after graduating from the military academy, when he joined the secret Free Officers Group formed by Nasser. Their goal was to overthrow Egypt's King Farouk, whom they saw as a British lackey, and kick the British out.
Men like Sadat felt this sense of exclusion, and their whole life was about nationalism. It was about retrieving Egypt for the Egyptians. And that's where Sadat and Nasser, that's what their historic role is about.
During World War II, Sadat and other officers tried to form a secret alliance with German troops fighting the British in North Africa. They hoped to provide intelligence on British troop movements, but their plot was discovered and Sadat was thrown in jail. He eventually escaped. Then, after the war, he was imprisoned a second time, for helping to plot the assassination of a pro-British Egyptian aristocrat. He was held in cell 54 of Cairo's central prison, a cell much like this one. Sadat says the 18 months he spent there changed his life.
This has formed my inner resistance, really, because I overcame this. The last 6 months, they were the most happiest time that I lived or will ever live. Why? In 2 places you shall always find yourself, your real self. Number 1 is prison, number 2 is war.
Cell 54 became Sadat's university. During his time in prison, he taught himself English and read everything he could get his hands on.
He had an incredible appetite for reading thereafter, and that gave him some significant advantages because he was an educated man, if you will, and he did know what other people thought by having read their books.
After his release from prison, Sadat was expelled from the army and eked out a living working first for a contracting business, then as a driver and a journalist. During those years, Sadat divorced his first wife, a girl from his village, and in 1949 married a lively 16-year-old beauty named Jihan Roof. Her mother was English, her father an Egyptian doctor. They would raise 6 children, including 2 girls by his previous marriage.
10 years ago, 15 years ago, did you think that Anwar al-Sadat was going to be this extraordinary a figure upon the world stage?
When I married my husband, there was a fortune teller who told me that you will become the first lady in this country. And of course I laughed. I was surprised. I don't think I imagined one day that I will be the first or my husband will be the first. But always I had the feeling in my back mind that there will be the time that we are going to do something for our country.
Sadat's rise to the presidency began in 1951, when he won reinstatement in the army and renewed contact with Nasser. Together, the two began plotting a military coup against King Farouk.
They saw Farouk as a tool of the colonial powers. They had good reason to think so. They saw him as corrupt.
Nasser launched his coup on July 23, 1952. Sadat broke the news to the Egyptian people over Cairo radio. And a short while later, King Farouk agreed to leave the country. As president, Nasser embraced socialism, redistributing land to the poor and nationalizing foreign-owned industries, including the Suez Canal, run jointly by the French and British. He was a strong, autocratic leader who championed Arab unity and became the de facto leader of the Arab world.
Nasser provided the pride that Egypt needed to restore its place in the Arab world, to restore its reputation. He was a leader of all Arabs.
During the Nasser years, Sadat held various positions, from editor of the government newspaper to speaker of the Egyptian parliament. Nasser distrusted his subordinates, so Sadat was careful to keep a low profile. Critics say he was weak. They called him Nasser's poodle. Sadat says he disagreed with Nasser at times, but did so in private.
Whenever one starts to criticize him openly, he loses his temper completely. I know this because he was my friend since we were 19. So whenever there were anything to criticize, I used to do this between me and him, either at his home or in my home, but not openly.
In December 1969, Nasser rewarded Sadat's loyalty by appointing him vice president.
Nasser appointed several vice presidents in his career, and it was a roulette game. People were appointed vice presidents, they were dismissed as vice president, so it was really the luck of the draw, if you will.
On September 28, 1970, Nasser died of a heart attack, and millions of Egyptians turned out to mourn. The fortune teller's prophecy many years earlier had come true. Anwar Sadat became president of Egypt, and Jehan Sadat his first lady. It was the fall of 1970. Jamal Abdel Nasser had just died, and his vice president, Anwar Sadat, had become president. Sadat's political rivals were stunned at the unexpected turn of events.
Sadat was viewed as a lightweight. Nasser had given him very little responsibility during the time he was vice president, and so people were not expecting much.
Sadat's opponents immediately began plotting his overthrow, but the plotters underestimated Sadat. He outwitted them, and 8 months after taking office, had them all jailed. When Sadat finally began the hard work of governing, he was shocked to discover that Nasser's socialist policies and his disastrous 1967 war with Israel had bankrupted the country. The war had lasted just 6 days. On the first day, Israel destroyed 3/4 of Egypt's aircraft. After that, it crushed the armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and seized large swaths of their land, including Egypt's Sinai Desert.
You had Egypt lose one of its key sources of income, and that is the Suez Canal.
Replenishing equipment lost in the war cost billions of dollars. A year-long war of attrition fought across the Suez Canal beginning in 1969 cost billions more.
You had cities across the Suez Canal that were devastated, with hundreds of thousands of people moving into Cairo, which became a very overcrowded city.
To address the country's problems, Sadat began cautiously turning away from the disastrous policies of his predecessor. He allowed political parties to form and returned private property seized under Nasser. For Sadat, the move towards greater democracy was a risky course. He was never the beloved leader that Nasser was, and the opponents of change were becoming more vocal. What's more, Sadat's fondness for the trappings of power distanced him from the common man.
Sadat was a very proud man. He had gone from nothing to being the president of Egypt. He was probably one of the best dressed men in Egypt. He enjoyed the privileges of wealth.
He had the riding crop under his arm. He was impeccably manicured and dressed. His uniforms were Hollywood style. His parades were sensational, Disney-like productions.
Sadat enjoyed media attention. He spoke fluent English and granted frequent interviews to the foreign press. He was a master at manipulating the press, so separating the person from the public image was always difficult.
Some people saw him as a new pharaoh or a new dictator, a new king. So he would go back to the village and try to show that he came from very humble origins, that his mother and father lived in this primitive town, and that he was still close to the soil.
Historians may disagree over who is the real Sadat, but there's no disagreement over his devotion to his country. Sadat was an ardent nationalist. To him, the presence of Israeli troops on Egyptian soil was a stain on the nation's honor.
It's just a very simple problem. Part of my land is occupied. This part of my land I want to be liberated by peaceful solution, or if it is not liberated by peaceful solution, it is my right and duty to liberate it.
To Sadat, the occupation of the Sinai and Egypt's economic problems were intertwined. If he could expel the Israelis, he could reopen the Suez Canal and reap the profits from Sinai oil fields developed by the Israelis. Sadat had tried negotiating through third parties to regain the Sinai, but had little patience for the hair-splitting involved in traditional diplomacy.
Sadat was just fed up with it all. He wanted to change the dice on the table. He wanted to break the impasse with a dramatic move.
He believed very profoundly, I think, that major events shift the psychological outlook, that shocks create a change in the environment in a way that opens up possibilities.
Sadat knew that nothing would create a greater shock than starting another war. He arrived at that conclusion, as he did most of his important decisions, alone and after hours of contemplation.
Well, I always find there is change with him when he is going to take such a very big decision. I notice it and I feel it immediately. And he takes a long time thinking and sitting alone, and then I can know what's going on.
On October 6, 1973, Egyptian troops crossed the Suez Canal, taking the Israelis completely by surprise. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Large numbers of Israeli soldiers were in synagogue. In the early days of the war, Sadat's troops and their allies, the Syrians, destroyed more than 100 Israeli tanks and killed more than 2,000 Israeli soldiers.
This was a great psychological boost for the Egyptians to have been able to surprise the Israelis and successfully begin to recapture that territory.
The tide eventually turned after the U.S. launched an airlift to replenish Israel's lost equipment. The Israelis surrounded part of Sadat's army and were threatening to annihilate it when the Soviet Union announced it was preparing to come to Egypt's aid. Suddenly, the conflict was threatening to escalate into a major superpower confrontation.
This certainly raised the flags for the Americans and for Henry Kissinger and the president.
Sadat knew his army couldn't defeat the Israelis. Military victory was never his goal. What he wanted was to force President Nixon and National Security Advisor Kissinger, who had seemingly lost interest in the Arab-Israeli conflict, to become re-involved.
He believed that without their direct involvement, the Arab-Israeli conflict could not be resolved. He believed the U.S. in particular held 90% of the cards, and there was no way of getting the U.S. to intervene unless there was a major crisis.
Sadat had staked his presidency on the outcome of the war. He was betting on a quick ceasefire and a diplomatic settlement favorable to Egypt.
For Sadat, this was an act of the most extreme courage because the results could have been quite different.
16 days after the war began, the UN finally arranged a ceasefire. Then, events took a turn Sadat never dreamed of. Arab oil producers spearheaded an oil embargo against the U.S. for supporting Israel. As a result, oil prices worldwide quadrupled, and Middle East oil producers suddenly found themselves awash in money. Responding to the crisis, President Nixon sent his national security advisor shuttling between Jerusalem and Cairo, trying to negotiate a resolution to the Egyptian-Israeli conflict.
All of these meant that the U.S. suddenly reshuffled its global priorities to focus primarily on addressing this issue. That's exactly what Sadat wanted. That's exactly what he expected.
Sadat's strategy had worked better than he could have imagined. After 3 years of living in Nasser's shadow, he was emerging as a dynamic new leader of the Egyptian people.
The war made Sadat into a national hero. I mean, everybody was convinced that he had accomplished what Nasser had tried to do and never could do. They were surprised by their own success, and it gave them an enormous boost of pride.
Sadat's dramatic gamble changed the Middle East landscape. The U.S. was now pressuring Israel to negotiate a withdrawal from the Sinai. The Israelis could no longer dismiss Egypt's military as inept. If Israel refused to negotiate, it did so at its own peril. Anwar Sadat's strategy to bring the U.S. into the Arab-Israeli conflict as a mediator had worked. 3 months after the 1973 war ended, the United Nations brokered an agreement for a partial Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai. When negotiations for a second withdrawal broke down, Sadat rolled the dice once again. With Israeli artillery still in range, Sadat announced that Egyptian engineers would begin clearing the Suez Canal of debris from the '67 war and reopen it to international shipping.
It was a very smart move on the part of Sadat to declare the clearing of the canal. What Sadat did was he got the entire world salivating over having the canal open again, because it was a costly proposition not to be able to move through the canal.
The years following the '73 war were heady times for Sadat and Egypt. The U.S. pumped in large amounts of foreign aid. Sadat opened Egypt's economy to foreign investment. He watched other Arab states getting rich from skyrocketing oil prices and envisioned large investments flowing into his country.
The city that we are going to see now, the 10th of Ramadan, is the first one. I'm planning for a chain of cities on this 100 kilometers. A chain of cities and factories. Pioneering, real pioneering.
In fact, large sums of money did flow to Egypt, but it wasn't shared equally.
As a result of the war and the subsequent opening of Egypt and the American aid, the upper and upper middle classes of Egypt prospered. Foreign goods came in. There was a degree of affluence that hadn't been seen in those classes, but nothing changed for the vast majority of the Egyptian public.
In fact, things got worse. Between 1973 and '76, inflation sent prices soaring. To keep staples like bread, rice, and cooking gas affordable for the average Egyptian, Sadat subsidized the prices by borrowing large sums of money from foreign lenders. By 1977, the foreign debt was so large he was forced to cut subsidies and allow prices to rise. That triggered widespread rioting. Many of the protesters blamed Sadat personally. Sadat dresses in style, they shouted, while we live 7 to a room.
And people went out into the streets chanting, "Hero of the crossing, where's breakfast?" They were running out of tea, they were running out of sugar, they couldn't afford things, there was inflation in the country.
At the time of the riots, Sadat was spending about half Egypt's annual budget on the military. The riots convinced him that Egypt simply couldn't afford guns and butter. To care for its people, it had to make peace with Israel. Sadat knew that after 3 decades of bloodshed, negotiations would be extremely difficult. He needed a way to break through the years of hatred and mistrust.
It was typical of Sadat that when he starts to get frustrated, he looks to the kind of move that will create a major impression, that will have a major impact on changing the ground.
Sadat considered several options. Characteristically, he chose the most dramatic: a solo journey into the enemy's heartland. Sadat's advisors opposed his going. Palestinian extremists threatened to assassinate him if he did. But once again, Sadat summoned the courage to do what he thought was best for Egypt. A devout Muslim, he put his faith in Allah.
One day he told me, "Don't worry, because you are not going to add 1 minute or take 1 minute. It's my fate. Whenever it's finished, then nobody can add anything."
On the drive to Jerusalem to address the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, he was delighted by the crowds of spectators who had turned out to cheer his arrival. Some had lost loved ones in the '73 war. At the Knesset, his arrival was heralded with trumpets and applause. And then he spoke the words Israelis had waited so long to hear.
You wish to live amongst us in this part of the world, and we tell you with all sincerity that we welcome you amongst us. with all safety and security.
In return, Sadat asked Israel to recognize the rights of the Palestinians to their own homeland and to return to Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, lands captured in the '67 war. Sadat's precedent-shattering trip lasted just 36 hours. Before leaving, he made time to meet with an old enemy, former Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir.
Let us decide one thing. It must go on, face to face, between us and between you, so that even an old lady like I am will live to see the day.
I've always said this.
You always call me an old lady, Mr. President.
Sadat's trip to Jerusalem was the beginning of a long and difficult journey. A month later, Prime Minister Begin flew to Cairo to begin the peace talks. Sadat thought his dramatic gesture would break the logjam, but discussions dragged on through the winter and spring of 1974. In July, a frustrated Sadat suspended negotiations. Then, President Carter stepped in and invited Sadat and Begin to his presidential retreat at Camp David to resume negotiating. The talks lasted 13 days.
The role of Jimmy Carter in the making of Camp David was essential because you had this very difficult customer, Menachem Begin, and you had this Egyptian president who believed that his diplomacy, that his trip to Jerusalem was this great unmatched event in human history. And so the expectations of Sadat were sky high, and the willingness of Menachem Begin to make concessions was quite limited.
One of the real talents of Sadat was that he could break through the normal way of thinking about things. He often surprised his own people by accepting things that Begin had proposed, which they would have lawyered to death, but Sadat took them and agreed to them. And so there was a constant tension. Half the negotiations were between the Egyptians and Sadat. The other half were between Sadat and Begin.
On the 13th day, President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin signed what were known as the Camp David Accords.
Camp David negotiations had two separate agreements. One was related to Israeli withdrawal and Egyptian-Israeli peace, and the other was related to an autonomy for the Palestinians that ultimately was going to lead to a state. And that second never materialized.
For their historic agreement, Sadat and Begin were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1978, and Time magazine named Sadat its Man of the Year. Sadat had become an international superstar. Anwar Sadat's greatest achievement came on March 26, 1979, when he and Prime Minister Begin signed an Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty.
The peace treaty was the culmination of what Sadat had been going after, which was the total return of the Sinai. He proved that he had restored what Nasser had lost. He proved that he was no longer Nasser's lapdog and that he had restored Egyptian pride.
Sadat's quest for peace dramatically altered the dynamics of war and peace in the Middle East.
There can be no war. There can be no big Arab-Israeli war without Egypt. This was the strategic importance of Egypt. He was removing the largest Arab army. With Egypt leaving the Arab-Israeli wars, the age of the major Arab-Israeli wars came to an end.
Sadat had hoped Egypt would reap great rewards in the wake of the peace treaty, but he was mistaken. In the Arab world, Sadat was vilified for failing to resolve the Palestinian issue. Many Arabs felt he had sold them out.
This was an ultimate act of dishonoring oneself. It was an ultimate act of surrender for many, many Arabs. They believed that he was trading away Egypt's advantages. He was walking away from the Palestinians. He was opting for a separate peace.
Sadat knew that an Egyptian peace agreement without resolution of the Palestinian issue would be unpopular among Arabs. But he didn't realize how unpopular.
He didn't expect that all the Arabs were going to boycott Egypt, or basically cut relations with Egypt, or expel Egypt from the Arab League.
The Arab boycott increased tensions between Sadat and his people. Many Egyptians who had been working in Arab countries and were an important source of income for their families were expelled and forced to return home where there were no jobs. Frustration over the lack of jobs was especially strong at the universities.
These university graduates and students who you would have assumed would have been able to foresee prosperity under this new regime were so disenchanted with the system that they turned, as was the case during the early days of Christianity, to the church, to the Muslim fundamentalist movement.
Universities became a hotbed of fundamentalist activities. Women adopted the traditional headdress. In class, they sat apart from the men. Campuses doubled as recruitment sites for Islamic activists.
Muslim fundamentalism, which would come to haunt Egypt and haunt the world in years to come, had begun to make inroads into the society. And there were pitched battles at one point in Cairo and in other parts of Egypt between the Copts, the Christians of the country, and the Muslim fundamentalists.
Sadat had originally tolerated the spread of Muslim fundamentalism as a counterbalance to other political opposition groups. But after the signing of the peace treaty and Sadat's rise to international stardom, he and the fundamentalists found themselves increasingly at odds.
The last 2-3 years of Anwar Sadat's life were about this juxtaposition between the stardom of Anwar Sadat abroad and the dissatisfaction of Egyptians with his regime.
There were real pockets of opposition and hostility that simply grew during this period, and they were able to use these attributes, his beautifully tailored suits, his Pierre Cardin uniforms, his multiple palaces, which were beautiful, by the way. They're able to use it against him and to start to break down his reputation.
Islamic fundamentalists argued that he had been seduced by the bright lights of foreign lands, that he was estranged from his people, and preferred the company of international celebrities.
He loved welcoming Elizabeth Taylor to Egypt. Well, she had once played Cleopatra, so she was on familiar ground. He loved being with Walter Cronkite. He loved being with Barbara Walters. He took to America. America was very seductive to him.
In conservative, traditional Egypt, Jihan Sadat, Sadat's socially progressive wife, was even more controversial than her husband.
Jihan Sadat was a believer in women's rights. She wanted to turn around the life of the average woman in the Egyptian society. And so she went out and publicly talked about women's rights, about equality, about family planning. All of this was anathema to the established hierarchy among the males of Egypt.
Hostility toward Sadat intensified in 1979 after Islamic revolutionaries overthrew Sadat's friend, the pro-Western Shah of Iran. Placing friendship above politics, Sadat offered the ailing Shah political asylum in Egypt.
So things were quite difficult for him, and Egypt was becoming an increasingly bitter, an unhappy country. And Sadat himself was spending more and more time away from Cairo. He hated the Cairenes. He hated the intellectuals. He hated the journalists. And he developed this fantasy of peasant Egypt. He would go back to his village.
But the serenity of the village was no cure for what ailed him. Sadat had always kept his own counsel. Now he was isolated and growing increasingly agitated. In September 1981, bloody rioting broke out between Egypt's Muslim fundamentalists and its Coptic Christian minority. In response, Sadat ordered the imprisonment of some 1,500 people.
It was a large number of people, but it wasn't just the number. The numbers don't tell the story. The kind of people he imprisoned tell the story. They were professionals. They were former ministers. There was a man who was a pasha in the old days, who was a leader of a bourgeois political party. So there was a sense that this man was raiding his own country, that he was showing it no respect.
Jihan Sadat, to her credit, speaks of this as one of his biggest mistakes and speaks of counseling him or asking him questions about whether it was the right thing to do.
When an American reporter asked if he consulted with the U.S. before the crackdown, Sadat snapped.
No one respects his responsibility, respects his people, respects his dignity, respects the dignity of his people, permits any other power to interfere in his decision.
Sadat came unhinged at the end. There really was something of an individual disturbance at the end. He couldn't believe that his country was not grateful. He couldn't believe that people were still talking to him about the ghost of Jamal Abdel Nasser and the shadow of Jamal Abdel Nasser.
On October 6th, the 8th anniversary of the 1973 war, Sadat got dressed in a uniform he had designed especially for the occasion and went to the annual parade celebrating his greatest victory.
Well, the parade was in progress. It had been going on for more than an hour. And Sadat would stand up every so often and salute the various units that went by. And then, all of a sudden, one of the trucks carrying 8 men suddenly stopped in front of the reviewing stand. But the men stood up, and Sadat himself stood up and gave them the salute. And they opened fire.
President Sadat was struck several times. CBS News correspondent Mitchell Krause was there.
And pandemonium broke loose. As you can see, everywhere you look, bodies were on the ground and people were running.
The actual perpetrators of the plot against Sadat were Islamic fundamentalists associated with groups that ultimately helped form Al-Qaeda.
There is the body of Sadat beneath those of others.
President Sadat died 2 hours later in a military hospital. Anwar Sadat's funeral was attended by 800 world leaders, including 3 former U.S. presidents and Prime Minister Menachem Begin. But there were only 3 Arab heads of state from the Sudan, Oman, and Somalia. Among the Egyptian people, there was shock and disbelief, but little mourning.
The hearts of the Egyptian people were never with him in the sense that they were with Nasser. When he died, one of the surprises that we in the Western press had was that there was no outpouring of grief following his death.
Outside Egypt, Palestinians rejoiced at news of Sadat's assassination. In Beirut, they fired shots in the air and carried a mock coffin. To this day, Sadat remains a controversial figure, a hero in the West, largely forgotten in Egypt itself.
Sadat's importance is that he broke down the rejection that the Arab world had to the existence of Israel. Since Sadat, the Arab world has come to accept that Israel is a part of the region. That is an incredible change in what's happened in the region.
You know, it's said of Moses that he saw the promised land, but he couldn't go there, he couldn't enter it. Well, ironically, the sad thing for Anwar Sadat, he secured the liberation of Sinai, the restoration of its sovereignty to Egypt, but it was done in April 1982.
Sadat knew he might not live to see that day, so he wrote his own epitaph, which is inscribed on his tomb. Anwar el-Sadat, hero of war, hero of peace, lived for peace, and was martyred for his principles.